So good afternoon and welcome everyone. This is the second of our autumn casework webinars, and they were organised by the National Training Committee. Now, I would say if you have any further ideas for webinars, if you can contact your National Executive member, they can pass them to the Chair of Training, Mark Dickinson, and they can be discussed at a future Training Committee meeting. We also have the Rise of the Far Right, which is happening on the 24th of November, and Addressing LGBTI Discrimination in the Workplace on the 8th of December. And they are the last two of the autumn webinars, and I'll put the link in the chat afterwards. So I'd like to welcome Darren Northcott, who's the National Official for Education, and Wayne Bates, who's the National Negotiating Official and the Lead for Health and Safety. And they're going to deliver our session today on behaviour management policies and the risk assessment of pupils. Any questions, pop in the Q&A section and they will answer them at the end. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kim, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, as Kim says, my name is Darren Northcott. I'm the National Official for Education. Now, unfortunately, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so hopefully I will last out for the length of my presentation in a way that you can understand. And then Wayne will follow me, look specifically at some of the issues around risk assessing pupils in respect of their behaviour. But I'm going to share my screen and get copies of these slides if you want them. Let me just put that up. Hopefully you can all see that. I assume that's all right. Let me just go to the slideshow. Excellent. So as I say, you'll get copies of these slides if you find them useful. But everything I'm going to say in the next few minutes, all the information is on our website, but this might be quite a useful set of slides for you to have at hand. So what we'll do is just begin by reminding ourselves about the emphasis that we, the NASUWT, place on good behaviour and discipline in schools. I'll then talk about what we know about members' experiences currently around pupil behaviour in the UK, and what action we can take at national and local levels to try and address some of those issues. But just to begin, and it probably doesn't need stating, but I don't think it can be stated too infrequently, is the importance that we, the NASUWT, place on good behaviour in schools. And I think it is fair to say that among teacher and leader unions, we have historically and currently placed particular emphasis on the importance of schools being safe, calm learning environments for pupils. So I've just taken this from our behaviour position statement. We recently went back and looked at conference resolutions over the past 10, 15 years, and this position, emphasising the importance of behaviour and good discipline in schools, comes up time and time again. So it's an unambiguous policy position for the NASUWT. And it's given that level of priority for very good reasons. And what our members have told us over the years and continue to tell us is that good behaviour in schools is important in respect of teachers' legitimate interests, so their physical and psychological welfare, and their ability to discharge their professional duties to teach in an environment that is safe. But also our members are equally clear that good behaviour in schools reflects learners' legitimate interests and their ability to benefit from the educational provision that's made available to them, the right that they have to learn in a safe and educationally conducive environment. So the case for emphasising behaviour is extremely clear. And the issue remains significant, perhaps is becoming even more of a concern. So we've conducted a lot of surveys and research into behaviour, as have others, and that underlines the importance of good behaviour for teachers, leaders, and parents. So it has been an issue, continues to be an issue perhaps it's becoming even more of an issue. We can think about why that might be the case. One thing we've always done is to place the issue into its appropriate context. So something former General Secretary Chris Keats used to say is that most behaviour in most schools most of the time is good, and that's probably still true, but there are genuine concerns, and it's important to recognise those. So we conducted a survey. All the information about this survey is on our website if you want to look at it, but I'll give you some of the headlines. We conducted a survey of our members on behaviour during May and June of this year, and some of those findings are extremely concerning. So I've pulled a few out here, but I think the is well worth a view. So among other findings, 37% respondents said that they had experienced physical abuse or violence from pupils over the past year. 90% report verbal abuse or violence from pupils over the same period. Backchat and rudeness are perhaps the most common forms of misbehaviour that are experienced. 97%. You wonder who those 3% of teachers are who haven't experienced backchat and rudeness. 81% of members have been sworn at. I think if you looked back at the education system 20, 25 years ago, and you asked that same question, you wouldn't find 81% of teachers saying they had been sworn at. Experience of more extreme misbehaviour. So I think the notion of low-level misbehaviour, low-level misconduct, perhaps is sometimes a bit misleading. Some behaviour that's described as low-level misbehaviour sometimes can be extremely unsettling, alarming and disruptive. But if we want to talk about more extreme misbehaviour, then some of the experiences that our members report are extremely worrying. So 14% of teachers have been hit, punched, 11% have been kicked, 39%, 4 in 10 have been shoved or barged, 6% have been spat at, and 2% have been headbutted. In terms of trend, so asking teachers and leaders working in schools across the UK, what do they see in terms of trends? Is it getting better, worse, or remaining the same? Very clear message. 89% of our members say that the number of exhibiting violent and abusive behaviours has increased, and the number of pupils, again, verbally abusing staff, our members tell us almost universally that has increased as well. And the impact on teachers, very clear. 63% experience stress as a direct result of their experience of pupil misbehaviour and indiscipline. 9% took time off solely as a result of the impact that poor pupil behaviour had on them. Half experienced anxiety as a result of pupil indiscipline, and 17% reported suffering with depression as a result of poor behaviour in the schools and other settings in which they work. So what are the causes of this? And again, I think our members are very clear the causes are. And in effect, you can look at national level causes and local level causes, because government has a critical role in supporting schools to promote good behaviour. Schools and employers have a critical role to play as well. So one of the things that we see from our survey work, not just that we conducted earlier this year, but previous surveys and surveys conducted by others as well, is that you can take schools in very similar circumstances, and one tends to have a better approach to managing behaviour than others. The experience of members, the experience of learners in those schools tends to be better. So there are things that can be done at school and employer level. But at national level, if you think about some of those issues that impact upon behaviour that our members report, is that we know that there is a correlation between the support that children and young people get in respect of their mental health, particularly post-pandemic. Do point to the pandemic as a kind of marker, a stage, if you like, that eventually resulted in deteriorations in behaviour. So at national level, support through funding and resources, so children who need that support, providing sources of external expertise for schools. That used to be more available than it is currently, access to advice and support when difficulties arise. So what lots of schools report is that when advice beyond the school is sought, when expert advice is sought, it often isn't there, and certainly isn't there in many cases, maybe even in most cases, to the extent that it was previously. Government also has a very important providing guidance and expectations around behaviour for school. So what does the government, as the ultimate decision maker for our education system, does it think good looks like in respect of schools' management of behaviour? How effective is its guidance, and how useful is that? What messages does it send about what it thinks good behaviour management should look like? Because if government sets that message, it makes it easier to argue for those points at a school and an employer level. And that really does make a difference. So if you look, for example, at the situation in Scotland, some of you may have had some experience of what are known as restorative behaviour approaches. Controversial, there's some advice and guidance on our website about dealing with that. But the approach to restorative behaviour that's mandated by the Scottish government, so it sets, if you like, the tone at the national level, that sits down across local authorities and across schools into what is acceptable. And some of that practice is extremely, it lets down teachers and it lets down pupils. But the reason it's so prevalent across Scotland is in part a result of very unhelpful messages and guidance from the government in Scotland on the management behaviour, and that's a point we are continuing to pursue with the Scottish government and with employers in Scotland. And then the signals that government send are very important as well. So you might recall earlier this year, there was an outbreak of what you might call large-scale pupil disorder in schools. It was reported in the media. We represented members and supported members working in schools where that was happening. So this was social media organised violence and disruption by pupils on a large scale. And we were very clear that that was unacceptable. And we wrote to the Secretary of State for Education saying that one of the things she could do is condemn that behaviour publicly in her own name. She should also condemn those parents who were encouraging children to act in that way, and she refused to do it. So teachers in those circumstances would be forgiven for thinking that the government didn't really have their back. Teachers working in schools need to know that the government understands the challenges that teachers can face in respect of managing behaviour, and that the government will do everything it can, including being clear in its support. And this government let down teachers and I would say pupils very badly in that instance. There are absolutely things that government can do: investment in services, good guidance, sending clear messages. But we also know that local level action is extremely important as well. So going back to what we were saying earlier, that variation between schools. So schools in similar circumstances, we find one has better behaviour than others. We know from our own experience, particularly through us taking industrial action in the most serious cases, how schools will have poor behaviour management can improve as long as certain things are put in place. So we know at local level, effective, consistent behaviour management policies are absolutely critical. Again, there's a lot of advice and guidance on our website about how those things can be secured in practice. It's extremely important. It's pretty a pretty consistent experience for you, I'm sure, but certainly for all of those who represent NASWT members, that if you have a school, you have in England, say, a multi-academy trust, but if you have a setting where behaviour isn't acceptable, when you dig into that, you often find that at the heart of it, there isn't a consistent and effective behaviour management policy in place. And then schools, again, that get this more right than others, provide backing to teachers in classrooms. So our survey showed that many teachers reported they don't use the official behaviour management reporting process in school because they don't think that anything would be done about it. And you also see cultures, and you see this increasing, the prevalence of cultures that puts all the responsibility and all the blame for behaviour in schools and directs that to individual teachers. So a kind of culture of teacher blaming. So if pupils are misbehaving in your class, that's your fault as a teacher, and leaving aside all the responsibilities that those that run and manage schools have for creating the climate within which good individual teacher behaviour management can take place. So teacher blaming, very prevalent. The reason your children are misbehaving is because your lesson isn't very good, the lesson is dull. That becomes extremely prevalent. Again, in schools where we intervene to support members, that is often something we encounter, a culture of teacher blaming, rather than a culture of understanding that good behaviour is everyone's business in the school, and that includes those that are responsible for managing the school. That culture, again, is a very frequently recurring hallmark of schools where behaviour is good. So where behaviour is good, where our members report better behaviour than perhaps other members report elsewhere, that culture seems to come up time and time again, a sense that everyone has a responsibility to work together to promote good behaviour in school. When it's down to blaming individual teachers in classrooms, when you have that culture, you often have behaviour exhibited by pupils as a result. So for us, we conduct a survey. That survey, I think, reinforces some long-standing messages. So from the union's point of view, if we can look at this in respect of national level factors and local level factors, then at national level, we will continue to do is press governments on funding for that support, developing what used to be called the team around the child. If you've got a child that has particular issues, what support is available to help that child? Collaboration between those services as well. One of the things that I think is particularly difficult in England, but also elsewhere across the UK at the moment, is that previous approaches where different services for children collaborated, schools collaborated, a lot of that collaboration has been undermined. We want to see the government backing schools and backing teachers when they take the action they need to take to keep themselves, their colleagues, and everyone in that school community safe, and providing good quality, effective advice. Some of the government's guidance and advice across the various administrations of the UK is pretty good, but not all of it is good. And I've talked earlier about some of the examples we see in Scotland, in particular, around national level advice. And then locally, promoting that good policy and practice is extremely important. We know what good looks like. The principles of good practice are well established. It's about promoting those. That's really key. Understanding also that behaviour is a legitimate bargaining issue in a collective bargaining context for us. It impacts upon teachers' employment conditions, the circumstances within which they work. It has a clear link, as Wayne will explain in a moment, to health and safety rights and expectations. So it is a bargaining issue, and it needs to be on bargaining agendas. Again, where we tend to see better practice is where we've been involved in developing the policies that are in place with employers, or perhaps even model local authority policies. And some of those are better than others, and the better ones are often better because we have been involved in shaping them. And of course, defending individual members, that is something we remain absolutely committed to doing. including through, where necessary, industrial action. We will never shy away taking industrial action to protect members from poor behaviour, where members are up for that action and where that action is required in order to secure an improvement in the way in which behaviour is managed in a particular school. I'll stop there. That's a bit of background and context on some of the policy we've been pursuing in respect to behaviour. So I'll stop my sharing and I'll pass over to Wayne, who will talk a bit more about the health and safety actions. So, Wayne.
Okay, thanks, Darren. I'll just start sharing my screen, hopefully. Okay. So, yeah, so I'm just going to have a quick talk about pupil risk assessments and the steps that need to go through to compile a pupil risk assessment, and really look at some of the background on why we need risk assessments. So why should a risk assessment be undertaken? Well, for a start, there's a legal duty on employers to do so. So the law says that the employers must do everything reasonably practicable to ensure the health, safety and welfare of the employees. And in this instance, employees would also mean volunteers under other pupils. And that stems from the Health and Safety at Work Act. And in addition to that, there's also the management of health and safety regulations that state that all hazards or workplace hazards must be risk assessed, and those risk assessments must be written down in instances where there are more than 5 employees, which is going to cover the vast majority, if not all, schools. So when should we consider doing a pupil risk assessment? Well, that's either when a pupil poses a potential risk, and a potential risk could stem from actions in the school or prior actions. So if you're in a secondary school, it could be reports from their primary school. It could be actions that have happened out of school that the school has become aware of. Or, of course, a risk assessment may be required if an incident has already occurred in school, or in that case, it may be that a new risk assessment is needed, or an existing risk assessment will need to be updated. And I mean, I think for some school leaders, there seems to be a little bit of almost mysticism over a pupil risk assessment. And certainly if we go back to before COVID, I think the standard and the knowledge generally in the school system of risk assessment was exceptionally poor. I don't think many school leaders understood the concept of a risk assessment, understood what it was there for, what it was to do. It then meant the fact that it wasn't just a box ticking exercise to have a little bit of paper to show if something goes wrong. I think things have improved through the COVID years because of the emphasis that was placed on risk assessment. So I think certainly school leaders are probably better equipped and better or more used to producing risk assessments. And to be honest, a pupil risk assessment is exactly the same as any other risk assessment, or at least the process that you go through to compile the assessment is exactly the same. So the risk assessment identifies hazards and then puts control measures in place to mitigate the risk. So you know that applies equally to a pupil that is potentially violent, as it does to somebody being on a roof and at risk of falling off. But one thing I do want to emphasise is that particularly with pupil risk assessment, that's consultation and especially sharing is absolutely key. There's very little point in doing a risk assessment if it then sits in a folder, in a physical folder or a virtual folder, and nobody gets to see it. So certainly in the case of a pupil risk assessment, it should be shared with all relevant staff, and in general, relevant staff is going to be anybody that will come in or potentially come into contact with the people in question. So it's probably not going to be just the teachers who teach the pupil directly, whether that's in the class in a primary school or in the subjects in a secondary school. Because of the way obviously schools operate, that pupil could have interactions with any member of staff in the building. So it needs to be shared with all the teaching staff, but also all the support staff as well, including reception staff, cleaners, literally anyone who could potentially come into contact with that individual. So this is just a little graphic taken from the Health and Safety Executive, which really demonstrates the steps that are needed with any risk assessment. And as I said, pupil risk assessment is no different. So I'll go through each of these in more detail in a second. But the important thing is that you start at the top of that, so at the top of that triangle with elimination, and then work your way down. And then when you get to PPE, and I'll stress this further in a bit, PPE should only be an absolute last resort when everything else has been tried and either failed or hasn't mitigated the risk effectively. In a lot of risk assessments, I've seen PPE being the go-to measure. And that should not be the case. PPE should always be the last resort when everything else has already been tried and has not succeeded in reducing the risk to an acceptable level. So, going down that triangle, elimination in pupil terms, elimination is most likely going to be around the elimination of activities that are known to increase the risk of an incident. It could also mean things like eliminating interactions between certain pupils that are known to cause or potentially increase the risk of an incident. Of course, in some instances, when the risk assessment process is gone through, it will be deemed that the school is not equipped to cater for that pupil. And no matter what steps, no matter what control measures that school's able to put in place, that pupil is still going to be or present rather a unacceptably high level of risk, and in which case exclusion may be required, and some form of alternative provision may also be required. So once we've gone through the elimination stage and we've done all we can there, then we come to substitution, which essentially, can we do something else that will reduce the risk of an incident? So the example I've put there is not using sharp items. So if you're in a craft area, is there any other items you can use that remove sharp items, so you're reducing the risk of an item being used as a weapon? Engineering controls are the next stage. So these are essentially, what can we do to the workplace, to a physical workplace, to reduce the risk of an incident? So it could be fitting screens, it could be ensuring that doors can easily be locked, and of course easily unlocked as well, and having easy ways to summon assistance and making sure that when assistance is summoned, it actually arrives. It can also mean not only, of course, summoning assistance within the school. It may be that there's a clear pathway for, if the police need to be called, then there's a clear pathway and everybody understands who calls the police, whose duty it is, and how that gets escalated. Administrative controls could mean policies and procedures, such as the use of force or physical restraints, could be signed. Training will be a key aspect of this, particularly around the use of force and physical restraint, but also in terms of behaviour management strategies and things like that. So This is so the administrative controls are all about what can we do to put in place effectively policies and procedures to mitigate something happening. And then finally, as I said, PPE, last resort. So if we can't put any other suitable risk assessment in, sorry, suitable control measure to reduce and mitigate against the risk of an incident, then we should consider PPE. And that could, in terms of pupil incidents, that could mean things like visors to prevent spitting. It could mean anti-bite sleeves, and so on and so forth. But I can't really stress enough that PPE should always be that last resort. We shouldn't be relying on that in the first instance. Some other points. So the risk assessment should cover how hazards are mitigated for all individuals, not just staff. So that will include, as it means, certainly include support staff, but will also include volunteers. Will also include other pupils as well. Other pupils have the right to attend school without risk of being attacked. So the risk assessment should also cover everybody within the school building and within the school community. As well as listing the control methods to prevent an incident, it should also state what to do if an incident occurs. So if we have a pupil that becomes violent, what are the steps that need to be taken then? And I mean, I've seen some very, very poor examples of this. One from Scotland that I remember is basically that if an incident occurs and that a member of staff is injured, just send another member of staff in. And it just, you know, it needs to be better thought out than that. There needs to be a clear protocol and a clear procedure of how we're going to handle an incident if it happens. And that, of course, should include immediate measures to bring the situation under control, and may include as well, you know, the involvement of outside agencies such as the police. An important point also is that it must include what we're going to do after an incident has taken place. So that will include support for the staff involved and indeed for the pupils involved. It will also involve the arrangements for the investigation of the incident, because of course in any incident, you know, it's important for the school and particularly for the school leaders to reflect on what's happened and then to review the risk assessment as a result of that. And it may not just be the risk assessment of the pupil involved. If there has been some kind of systemic failure in the school as a result of what's happening, it may be that all the pupil risk assessments and indeed the behaviour management approach of the entire school needs to be reviewed and needs to be updated. And then on to consultation and sharing. I said these are absolutely critical in any risk assessment, but particularly in a pupil risk assessment. It's a legal requirement for employers to consult with staff, either through a health and safety representative or directly with staff, or indeed both. And that is important because the people that are on the ground, so the teachers and the support staff that are dealing with the pupil day in, day out, need to be consulted because they will be able to see the deficiencies and where the risk assessment either it won't be effective or may need to be changed and make it more effective. They may also be able to suggest additional control measures that may not be in the risk assessment to start with. It's also a legal requirement that all risk assessments are shared with relevant staff. And as I said earlier, there's simply no point undertaking a risk assessment if it then just sits on a shelf somewhere or sits in a virtual folder on a computer screen or computer system. Relevant staff in this case, again, as I said earlier, it's going to be anybody who's likely to come into contact with the pupil concerned, not just those who teach the individual. And there has been some cases that have ended up in prosecutions where risk assessment has been done and then it hasn't been shared. Somebody's then come across the pupil misbehaving or doing something, and that interaction, because they weren't aware of the steps, they weren't aware of the risk assessment, that has led to an incident where people have become quite seriously injured. So, I can't really stress that enough. And that goes for all risk assessments, of course. Going back to my example about working at height, no point having a working at height risk assessment if you're not going to share it with the people that are going on the roof. So it's absolutely key for an effective system. And I just want to finish with a bit of a cautionary tale. So this is going back a couple of years. Now, the Luton Borough Council was fined £164,000. They were actually fined £300,000, but it was reduced on the basis that the council couldn't afford to pay £300,000. After a teacher was attacked by a pupil in a maintained school in Luton. Now, that pupil had a history of violence, and yet the investigation found that there was significant shortcomings in relation to the measures. Effectively, the risk assessment that was in place was insufficient. It didn't put into place sufficient control measures to deal with that pupil, and that led to a teacher suffering life-changing injuries. So the council was found to have inadequate systems of oversight for a school. So even though it's a maintained school and schools operate under local management, the employer is still, in that case, the local authority. And the court found that the oversight of the local authority was not sufficient to pick up the deficiencies in that risk assessment. And as a final comment, sadly, this isn't the first time that such events have occurred. And in many cases, these situations are avoidable and shouldn't have led to the outcome that they did. They shouldn't have led to teachers and other people being injured. And it's just because the risk assessment process either wasn't followed, wasn't put in place, or then the risk assessment, the control measures in the risk assessment weren't put in place, or it simply wasn't shared with the staff that it should have been. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I think there's a few questions that popped up in the chat and in the Q&A.
Thanks, Wayne. I've had a look at some of the questions. We had a really good question, I think, from Robert, with a really good answer from Sharon. So I think I would endorse Sharon's answer, but just in case colleagues haven't had a chance to look at it, Robert's question was around displaying challenging behaviours, including verbal abuse. What often happens is not just in your experience, Robert, it does happen elsewhere as well, is that on asking for a risk assessment, you get told that the children circumstance doesn't meet the criteria, and anyway, all that's covered through a student support plan. And obviously that's becoming more of an issue as we see more children with sometimes quite profound special educational needs in schools. And you've got Sharon's response, which again I agree with entirely, is they're two separate, I don't know if you agree, Wayne, they're two separate things. The risk assessment is everything Wayne's just described, and a student support plan is for the student. Now, clearly, they've both got to align. You can't have something expressed in a risk assessment that's undermined by something that's in the student support plan. So they should be developed in a coherent way. But I think Sharon's absolutely right. Student support plans do not override the requirements that Wayne's just talked about in respect of risk assessment, because of the, among other things, the legislative expectations and requirements relate to the health and safety of work and others in workplaces. Do you agree, Wayne?
Absolutely. I mean, using those examples there, I'd say that those schools and those employers really are playing with fire. Because if an incident occurs and somebody is badly injured, and the health and safety executive roll up, the first thing they're going to say is, where's the risk assessment? And if the employer then says, well, we've got this student support plan, I don't think the health and safety executive is going to be particularly impressed. And I mean, I don't understand what the reticence is from an employer or from a school leader to do a risk assessment. It should be, you know, second nature, why not, particularly through the COVID years. So I don't understand where this kind of reticence comes from, but absolutely, you know, a support plan for a child is a support plan for a child, and a risk assessment is how we're going to control the risk that child presents. They've got to be coherent. They've got to complement each other, but they serve very, very different purposes.
And I mean, Caroline makes the point as well that, you know, she's encountered similar practices as well. And I'd agree with Sharon's point about the fact that if we don't address the needs of the pupil, we keep pupils safe, including the pupil that might be the object of concern or interest. And I think that does raise safeguarding issues, and we've certainly seen that in our casework. So some really good points there. Just moving over to the Q&A. Fiona has asked a couple of questions about our survey. This is a really good point about the different experiences of staff in schools and other settings in terms of their experiences of behaviour and in discipline. And one thing we are doing, published, and it's on our website, published a kind of initial set of findings from our survey. One of the things we're doing currently is looking into the data that we gathered through the survey to look at just that issue, the extent to which experience of discipline varies by protected characteristic, and also your point about the differences between sectors. So something we have seen much more commonly cited by members than maybe we used to 10, 15 years ago, are members working in post-16 settings, and members working in those settings reporting a student in discipline far more frequently than they did previously. So it's really important, the different experiences that members have by protected characteristic and by sector. We will be looking into that. We'll be doing some more work on that, Fiona, because it is an extremely important point. So it's a point well made there, I think. Is there anything? Let me just have a look. Is there anything else?
I think Kate asked about how do you go about looking to refusal to seek ballot. That would be through your national executive member. So that ballot for refusal to seek is just another form of industrial action, in the same way as action short of strike action, or indeed strike action. So we cover that through the national executive member. And actually, I've just seen that Sharon's replied to that in apologies. But going back to Sharon's comment above, I think it's Sharon's comment above that. Yeah, surely those employers are potentially breaking the law. Absolutely. The law couldn't be clearer in this regard. Both the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and the Management of Health and Safety Regulations 1999. Both say a risk assessment has to be there to ensure that the employer is doing everything reasonably practicable to ensure the health, safety and welfare of everyone on the premises. So if they're not doing it, then yes, there's a potential breach that could be reported to the health and safety executive. I have to say that, you know, the health and safety executive try their best, but they've had their budget slashed by over 50% over the last decade. So they don't always operate as fast as we'd like them to. But certainly reminding employers that if something happens and they haven't followed what they should have done under the legislation, then the outcome is going to be far, far worse than it would have otherwise. And just bringing the examples like the Luton Borough Council one, and I've seen another one in the chat of a teacher being awarded, you know, £850,000 after an attack. these will be due to the employers not doing what they should do.
No, absolutely. Just a couple of final comments. I think we've got a comment from Alistair. Good afternoon, Alistair. And Alistair says, is it the case nationally members need to be more willing to report incidents? I mean, I think we certainly do come across cases where members perhaps would be advised to report incidents and choose not to do so. I think sometimes there's a reporting incident within schools, and as our survey showed, many members have given up doing that because they don't think anything will be done about it. I think our advice would always be, even if you are not confident that something will be done, it is extremely important you report cases of abuse that you've experienced from pupils or any other form of inappropriate behaviour. That has to be reported, and schools are expected to monitor the extent of that poor behaviour. So we would say that it's an issue for us, though, I think at a collective level, to engage and challenge school employers where our members tell us sometimes they don't feel there's an incident because they don't think that anything would be done about it. There are also, I don't know, Wayne, there are also legal requirements about Behaviour, perhaps in some circumstances, and other requirements where there is a legal expectation that if something is relevant in respect of the health and safety of a member of staff or someone on a school site, then there are legal requirements around reporting, particularly the most serious incidents.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Riddle would be the one. So if a specified injury occurs or someone's absent due to more than 7 days incapacitation due to an incident, then that would have to be reported to the health and safety executive. We know, though, Riddle, there's a huge amount of underreporting in Riddle as well. And I think Sharon hit the nail on the head. There are a lot of school leaders are reluctant because of the reflection on the school. And certainly, we've come across lots and lots of examples of people being, in some cases, quite badly injured, and pressure being applied for them not to report it to the police for exactly those reasons. So there is an issue with underreporting, but it is important that people report it, particularly if they're injured, at least it goes in the accident book, in case, that there's particularly in case there needs to be a personal injury claim at some later date. And just going on to Caroline's comment, we have got a document on pupil behaviour and risk assessment. I'll see if I can get the web address up, and I'll pop it into the chat.
But that point about the distinction between what we've just been talking about, coming from Robert's original question, that distinction between support plans and risk assessments being different, having different purposes and different functions. I mean, if we need to emphasise that message, fine, we'll absolutely do that. I mean, just on Ava's point as well around abusive parents, especially if they've been told they're not allowed on school premises but still insist on turning up verbally abusing staff. And ultimately, that is an employer responsibility, because that's about protecting the health, safety and welfare of those staff who are being verbally abused. In the most extreme cases, schools should contact the police if someone is on site who the school has the right to exclude from that site and has done so. But I think the broader issue, Ava, around the really serious issues that members face in respect of engagement with parents, particularly where that engagement is abusive. There's also a broader issue about sometimes the scale of that set of expectations about how often and how frequently a teacher will respond to, for example, emails and all of that. I think we do want to do some further work looking at the relationship between teachers and parents, what our expectations would be, so that everyone is clear of what we would advise members to do if those expectations aren't met. So it's a really important point, Ava, and it is something we will be looking at actively because of the amount of sometimes really troubling experiences that members have in terms of the way in which they're treated by parents.
Just picking up on that, Ava's last comment, it is their problem because assuming it's a community school,
right,
they're the employer, so they're the ones that will end up in the dock if there's an issue, in exactly the same way as Luton Borough Council ended up in the dock.
Agreed, absolutely. I think we've answered all those questions, Kim, I think.
That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. I definitely think we need to look to repeat this webinar because it really was invaluable in the information you've given today. So thank you ever so much for your time. And thank you everybody for attending, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and the weekend when it finally comes.